for inviting me and giving me this opportunity at this wonderful university to really think through and develop some ideas in a very warm context. As I was preparing, or just in these meetings, how many of you have seen the movie Lars and the Real Girl? Anybody? Okay, well, it's not that I have a thing for mannequins, if any of you know that movie. It's just, I just thought that movie was so extraordinary because in part it's about a community where everybody is nice to each other and respectful, even though they're not sure that they know what's going on or they believe what is happening is exactly makes sense. And I sort of felt that way this morning as I was introduced to people. I really appreciate that. I want to talk about something about language, about taking what we say seriously, and thinking about what the actual effect will be. I'm going to be talking about what I think the difference is between being pro-life and being pro-lives, but I want to make very clear that I don't think that that means that's going to solve very much. My son pointed out a cartoon to me that I think sums it up. It said, "New bumper sticker resolves abortion debate." It's not going to happen. These issues are too deep, too profound. I think there are some differences that we have that are not necessarily resolvable. But certainly we, and I hope I do this well, and I hope I'm not spending the next 3 weeks thinking, oh, I should have said, or I wish I hadn't, modeling doing it in a way that really is respectful. So much of what I've learned in the work that I've done is from listening to people who are very different from me, people who have very different political beliefs and life experiences. And I think of two examples leading to this. One was talking to a midwife in South Dakota. And she told me her life story. She, like many women and probably men, experienced a childhood that was full of abuse, where she was never felt empowered, was not sure she was a worthy human being, until she had a transformative event. And for her, that transformative event was giving birth. That in the process of bringing forth life, she, for the first time ever, felt that she was a good person and capable of doing things. And then her life's work became advocating on behalf of women giving birth and making sure that that was a respectful, empowering experience, not just something that happens that you get through and then start worrying about how you're going to pay for college. The other thing that has to do with how I think about this also happened in South Dakota. I was in Vermillion, South Dakota, where the university is, at a time when there was an effort to pass a law that would ban virtually all women in South Dakota from being able to have legal abortions. And there was a move to put that legislation on the ballot measure so the state could vote on it. And I happened to be in a bar, which sounds like, I walked into a bar now, and they were collecting signatures to put the legislation on the ballot measure. And one young woman, many actually, but the one in particular came up and said, "I'm pro-life, but I'm signing this." And I thought a lot about what she might have meant when she said that. I want to tell you a little bit about my work and how I came to some of these questions. I started out my legal work defending the right to choose abortion. I then started to get the cases where anti-abortion, pro-life arguments, I don't think those are the same things necessarily, but where those kinds of arguments were actually being used to hurt women who wanted to go to term. And that's become very much the focus of my work. And I want to start by giving you two examples of what I mean by that. One of them is Laura Pemberton. Laura Pemberton is a woman who I am sure defines herself as pro-life, who is very much against abortion. We got to know one another, we talked. I know that her both religious and political views were so intense that I think she believed if she was in a room with anybody from Planned Parenthood that she might burn in hell. She was pregnant with, I can't remember which, her 5th or 6th child, and she had had a previous C-section. She knew what cesarean surgery meant. She knew how it made her feel, that it was major surgery. It made it difficult for her to take care of the children she already had, and she really didn't want to have that surgery if she didn't need to. So she went in search of a place where she could go and at least try to give birth vaginally. But if that didn't work, she'd have the backup support. And every single hospital in her region of Florida said, you cannot give birth in our hospital unless you schedule a C-section, whether you need it or not. And she was really adamant that she did not want to have unnecessary surgery, so she decided to labor at home. And midwives are not allowed to attend in Florida and many states what are considered high-risk births. So her only option to avoid a planned unnecessary cesarean was to do it at home. During the course of her labor, she became dehydrated, and she went to the hospital to ask for intravenous fluids, at which point the staff became aware that she'd had prior cesarean surgery, and stuff started to happen. And word got to her that unless she agreed to cesarean surgery, they would not give her the fluids she requested. And some nurses, I think, said they're in the process of calling a judge. If you don't want to be forced to have the surgery, you better leave. And she slipped out the back door while she was in labor with her husband and went back home. She was at home laboring when she got the knock on the door. She opened the door, and it was a sheriff. And the sheriff was there with a court order to pick her up. And she tried desperately to stall him. She was in, I think she thought she was about 5 to 6 centimeters dilated at that point. She tried to stall them. She spent time in the bathroom. Please let me just stay here and deliver this baby. Eventually, the sheriff would not wait any longer. He took her into custody, put her in the back of an ambulance, strapped her legs together while she was in active labor, took her to the hospital where it had already been determined that by a judge and several doctors that she should have the surgery. As she was being prepped for surgery, she was given the opportunity to defend herself, to articulate her reasons for not wanting the surgery. She was not appointed counsel. She was not given an opportunity to call her own witnesses. None of the normal things that people who had been deprived of liberty, who were about to be forced to have surgery are. They forced her to have the surgery. She had a healthy baby, but she sued later on in federal court, arguing that a variety of her civil rights had been violated: her right to liberty, her right to bodily integrity, her right to privacy, her right to due process of law, all of those things. And the trial district court said none of those rights had been violated. And the reason they said was, they said that she had basically an obligation to the fetus she was carrying. Let me see if I can find the exact language. It said, the state's interest in preserving the life of the fetus outweighs the mother's own constitutional interest in determining whether she will bear a child and how she will deliver. And the court reasoned if the state could prohibit a woman after viability from having an abortion, it was actually a less serious intrusion to just tell her how she should give birth. Now I'll tell you, in terms of the opinions about the cesarean surgery and the risk, there was a lot of people across the spectrum thought that her particular previous cesarean surgery and so forth would have made it wise to have the surgery. But she really had studied this issue. She did not, had no intention of hurting her unborn child. And I can only tell you that she then went on, now having had 2 previous cesarean surgeries, to give birth to 3 more children, twins and a singleton, all vaginally. When we got to talking, we were having a conference where we brought advocates who were defending women's interests who were giving birth, with advocates who were defending women's right to have abortion together for the first time. We really wanted her to come and talk. And we talked many, many times before she decided at the last minute to come with her entire family, all of her kids. And we talked, and I said, the reason they did that to you is because of the anti-abortion legal arguments. And she wouldn't agree with me. And part of the reason I think she lost her civil case is that, as the court noted, she didn't argue against what has become called a fetal rights argument, because she believes in them. She values unborn life from the moment of conception. She's going to take all the babies God sends her way. But in fact, the legal argument that was used to strap her legs together, to force her to undergo that surgery, were exactly the same ones that are used by people who would like to see all abortions outlawed. I will say that she did come despite her fears. She came and was able to say she's against abortion. She told her story, and she was thrilled when she walked in the room and saw there Ina Mae Gaskin, the modern mother of midwifery in America, and felt very safe with that in that context. Another example, the Marlows, Amber and John Marlowe. They describe themselves as true believers in the Bible. They went to give birth to their 7th wanted child. They got to the hospital, and it was not a hospital they were known to. They were having some financial trouble, and the doctor decided the baby was too big to be delivered vaginally and said, you have to have a cesarean surgery. And neither of them thought, the husband or wife, thought this was necessary. She had delivered 6 other babies. She was very familiar with her body. And she and her husband refused. While decisions were being made, the hospital went and got a court order. They got an order that gave the hospital custody of the fetus, the unborn child, before, during, and after delivery. And the couple fled the hospital in active labor and fortunately found another hospital where they respected patients' rights, and she was able to give birth vaginally. Now, these are both women who had no intention of ending a pregnancy, harming their child in any way. And in fact, part of what I forgot to say about Laura Pemberton is in her answer to me. I said, I wish there was a way of sorting this out differently, but my understanding of the law and the arguments is you were forced to do this because of pro-life, anti-abortion arguments. And she said, that can't be, because I didn't intend to kill my baby. I'm different from those women. And what her case and others demonstrated to me is that once the state has the power to make these judgments, often in very abrupt circumstances, your true intent really doesn't matter. And what the court described her as is having bravado. So her very careful analysis of the risks for herself, for her future child, for her responsibilities to the child she already has, were all thrown out, and the court treated her as if she intended to kill her unborn child. What I've learned about these issues is that the debate, which has become so polarized, so binary, is whatever else is going on, it is distracting from other major issues, and which is why I love to have this chance to talk about, well, what do we really mean? What are the real consequences? And are there places where we do agree? I think they distract from issues like the fact that there is the most extraordinary accumulation of wealth in a very small number of people in this country right now, that we're a country that can boast of 2 million people in jail, 7.6 million under the control of the criminal justice system, more numerically and statistically, proportionately than any other country in the world, that 40 million people have no health insurance, 8.5 million of them are children, that there are families in distress, and that many of you in this room are going to end up, after you graduate, with $20, $30, $40, $80,000 of debt, which is not how America always was. And so some of those issues, I think, are the ones that I hope we make room for if we start to talk about things differently. One of the things I've also come to realize is the way in which we set things up. The very heated debate about abortion has kind of created this idea that there are 2 different kinds of women. Women who have abortions and kill their babies, and other kinds of women who give birth and have babies. The reality is that 61% of all women having abortions are already mothers. And 84% of all women eventually become pregnant, give birth, and become mothers. And I want to stop there for a moment and just say, how many of you have seen the movie The Business of Being Born? Okay. Please, if you do nothing else from this talk, watch that movie. Most of the women in this room, statistically speaking, will someday give birth. The men in this room will be fathers. And we live in a country where we now have an unprecedented rate of cesarean surgery, more than half of it believed to be unnecessary, unbelievably over-medicalized births that create risks to the pregnant woman, to her unborn child. One of the reasons we think there's so much preterm birth is overscheduled, too early cesarean surgeries. So one of the things that gets pushed out of the discussion is what's happening to women around giving birth. So I just want to ask you to put that on your list and maybe coordinate, maybe Women's Empowerment can sponsor showing that film. So where are we now in terms of what I mean about pro-life and pro-lives? There's something very attractive to me about pro-life. and I have always felt uncomfortable, given what I do and my particular politics, that I'm kind of excluded from that. I'm not allowed to be pro-life because of my positions and my work around the issue of abortion. And I think that the pro-life word has not really captured either many of the people who define themselves as pro-life, nor do I think the word pro-choice has captured many of the people who call themselves pro-choice. And I have found much more helpful the notion of pro-lives, a term I heard first at a conference at Yale. I think a Yale theologian came up with it, but I've never been able to track it down, so I can't quite give it its proper credit. But I thought aloud about what it means to me. And what I think it meant to the woman who signed the petition in South Dakota, the young woman who said, I'm pro-life, but I think we should have, I think this law that would ban virtually all women from having abortions is wrong. And what I think it meant to her is that she values unborn life. She takes it seriously. She does not want to see it killed. She does not want to see it disrespected. But at the same time, she also values the lives of women who become pregnant and give birth. And she also values and thinks about the children those women already have and the other obligations those women have to other family members and people in their communities. In the same way that, it's another place where we kind of, what is the difference between pro-life versus pro-lives? What does it mean? Abortion providers consistently report that at least a third of their patients identify as pro-life and against abortion. So what does that mean? How are they coming to an abortion clinic and ending a pregnancy and still calling themselves that? And again, it seems to me that they might more aptly be thought of as pro-lives. It's not that they don't think that they're killing or engaging in ending some kind of life, but they are thinking about their lives, again, the lives of their other children, their responsibilities in their communities. And it's also true that women who would never call themselves pro-life also feel very similar things. The pro-choice movement, I think, has done an enormous disservice to the women they claim to be representing. They use language like, we're pro-choice, my body, my rights, this is an issue of pro-choice versus pro-life. And I have to tell you that I understand why that is. That many of the leaders of that movement grew up at a time where the difference between their being able to be full and equal participants in society and not was having an unplanned, unwanted pregnancy. It meant the end of their education. It meant the end of their respect in their community. It meant the end of any hope for them to have lives beyond what they thought they were expected to do, which was only to be mothers and stay home and raise families. So that language resonates with them. It means a great deal to them. But it doesn't mean very much to women who are indigent, who are of color, who face any kind of societal discrimination, who could have an abortion but still may not be able to get an education, who still may not have the money to raise the children they already have or hope to have, who still face discrimination and being outsiders in terms of access to the education and financial security that many other people have. And that's why many women of color leaders came together and formed the reproductive justice movement, which said it's not enough to talk about reproductive health, and it's not enough to talk about rights. We have to talk about creating the social, economic circumstances that enable everyone to make healthy decisions that are good for them and their families. But I think the pro-choice movement did a disservice in another way. Early in my career, I worked at the National Abortion Rights Action League, and they had a campaign called Silent No More, where they collected letters from men and women describing why they or somebody they knew had an abortion. And I read hundreds, if not thousands, of these letters. And I promise you, not a single one said, I had an abortion because I have a right to. Not a single one said, I had an abortion because I have a right to choose, or it's my body, my life. Every single one of them told a story about a woman who felt responsibility to somebody. Herself, her future self, her husband who was going to Vietnam and her father who was dying, to the spina bifida baby she had already had who she was committed to taking care of no matter what and couldn't imagine providing that care if she had another child. They were talking about religion. They were talking about hopes and dreams connected to community. So that when phrases like pro-choice and my body, my life are thrown around, they're not actually representing the experience of most women who are actually ending their pregnancies and having abortions, most of whom feel that they are ending a life. But they are having abortions anyway. I want to talk a little more about the difference between pro-life and pro-lives. And I think the best example for me of what the difference is, the singular versus the plural, is a case that I worked directly on, Angela Carter. Angela Carter was 13 years old when she was diagnosed with a rare form of bone cancer. She was told she was terminal when she was 13. She found her way to doctors at NIH, and through years and years of multiple surgeries, chemotherapy, she eventually had an entire leg and half her pelvis removed. She survived into adulthood. So she was used to being told she was going to die, and she was used to defying that statement. She got married, she got pregnant. She had trouble finding OBGYN care because she was a disabled woman. How do you get a one-legged woman with a history of cancer onto your tail? Nobody wanted to treat her. So that's an issue out there, by the way. So she finds her way to a clinic at George Washington University, and they are treating her, and she starts to complain about not feeling well. And at first they dismiss her. You're just complaining because you don't get your pelvis, you don't have a whole pelvis, you're stretched out this way, that's all it is. When they finally listened to her, they discovered that she had a tumor the size of a football in her lungs. And at that point, she was 27 years old and 25 weeks pregnant. And her doctors, who were very involved with her care, her NIH doctor, they all talked about what to do, and there was absolutely no disagreement. The decision was to keep Angela Carter alive as long as possible. That's what she wanted. That's what her parents wanted. Her doctors agreed to it. This wasn't one of these doctors versus patient situations. But a hospital neonatologist walked by, and she overheard them saying, well, if she died, should we try to perform an emergency cesarean? What should we do? And the neonatologist, without ever talking to the woman, without ever talking to her physicians or anybody else, ran to the hospital lawyer and said, I can save all 25-week fetuses. In my hospital, they're viable. And they called an emergency court hearing to determine the rights of the fetus. And at that hearing, the doctor testified that she could save those babies. Angela's doctors and others said she didn't want the surgery. It was understood that it could actually kill her. By then, she was in intensive care. She was in and out of consciousness. She was able to communicate at times. She was intubated. When her doctors finally explained to her that she had been ordered by a court to have the surgery and it could kill her, she mouthed the words, I don't want it done, I don't want it done. There was an emergency appeal. All of this happened in one day. The court said essentially we have an obligation to rescue this fetus. This fetus has a right to life. They performed the surgery. The fetus, the baby, Lindsay Marie Carter, was born alive, but was really, in fact, so far from viability, died within 3 hours. And Angela Carter died 2 days later with the C-section listed as a contributing factor. We then, on behalf of the family, challenged the decision. I will add that Angela had a lawyer appointed for her on that day, but who knew nothing about reproductive rights law. The fetus actually had 2 lawyers representing it, or the state's interests in it, however you want to frame that. And we brought this challenge to the decision. There were only 2 groups that defended the decision, and one of them was the United Catholic Conference, the other was Americans United for Life. And it is in replaying this case over and over again, and I will tell you, the court ultimately said this court-ordered surgery was wrong, that women do not, upon becoming pregnant or at any point in their pregnancy, in effect, lose their civil rights, liberty, all of the ones that were right to life in this case. But it was after the fact, so that was the ruling, and I'm afraid to say it hasn't resolved the issue, as we all know in this room. But as I went back and looked over these issues, what became clear is the difference between pro-life in the singular and pro-lives. Because the brief defending what happened really said that there was only one life that mattered, and that was the life of the unborn child. And then that made me think about, well, what is the position, this was in the United Catholic Conference brief, what was the position of the United Catholic Conference in the Shivo case? In the Shivo case, as you may recall, they took the position that Ms. Shivo, who was in a persistent vegetative state, had a right to life. And among other things that were said was this notion that there has to be a certain quality of life before you have a right to life is utterly rejected. It stems from a very dangerous idea that there are some lives that aren't worth living. They never allowed anyone to think that Terri Schiavo's life was futile. But then when you look at the argument for why the forced surgery on Angela was justified, they say that Angela was lying near or very near death. At most, she possibly had 2 days to live. Angela Carter might have lived 24 to 48 hours without the surgery, and argued with or without cesarean operation, she would probably die within 24 or 48 hours. And while never was there a sense of futility for Terri Schiavo, they said specifically about Angela Carter, the decision to attempt to save Angela Carter's unborn child properly recognized the futility of improving Angela Carter's situation. And so for me, in looking at this case, over more than a decade now, it did highlight for me what the difference is between when, in the context of pregnancy, pro-life really does mean only one life, singular, and it inevitably or results in excluding lives, Angela's life. Or the possibility that had she received the radiation and the chemotherapy she wanted, that she might have lived longer and maybe have given, actually that's not true. I think that was finally decided that this was not a child who was ever going to survive, but that a different set of circumstances might happen elsewhere. So what happens, again, is life versus life. Sarah Burton, this is much more recent, 2009. She has 2 children at home, 2 jobs. She goes to the hospital in Florida. And she's a cigarette smoker. She seems to be having some preterm labor. And the hospital says, you must stay here. We're putting you in bed right now. And she says, no. She's, I think, 25 weeks pregnant also. She says, no, I can't do that. I have work, I have kids, I want to get a second opinion. They go and they get a court order and deprive her of her liberty and keep her in the hospital with the right to force her to undergo cesarean surgery. So it's again a situation in which a court decided pro-life versus pro-life, which would have included her and her obligations to the 2 children she had. Despite the bed rest and despite being held there, they forced her eventually to have the cesarean surgery, and this was a stillbirth. This fetus did not survive. It may never have been meant to survive, and it didn't work. So these are some examples of singular versus plural. I think part of what happens in this debate is that that the terms don't reflect all of the things people feel and think. I think most people who are pro-life don't really want to see those kinds of things happen to pregnant women, the ones who are going to term. I also don't think that they want to see women dying again from illegal abortions. It's estimated that before it was legalized, between 200,000 and 1.2 million women had illegal abortions. We know around the world 77,000 women die from illegal abortions. This is not an argument with you about which life is more valuable. It is to say that there are plural lives at stake, and I think most people on both sides of this issue recognize that. It's also that I don't think, when we think about what it means to be pro-life, I don't think most people would like to see the real consequences of criminalization, which would be the legal consequences of much of these ideas. And the consequences of that, before Roe, we had, in 1973, there were 200,000 people in American prisons. Now there are over 2 million. And the population has only grown, I think, by 40%, but the population of our prisons has grown 500%. Prisons now are big business. We have more prisons than Walmarts, prisons and jails, than we have Walmarts in this country. We also now have 37 states with feticide laws. We now have states that have declared the right to life if Roe is overturned, so that if women have illegal abortions, they're not going to go to jail for having an illegal abortion. They're going to go to jail as murderers. they're going to go to jail with a lifetime imprisonment for many of them. And how do I know this? I know this because very related things are happening already to women going to term. Melissa Rowland gave birth to twins. One was stillborn. She was arrested for murder in Utah, and the theory was that she had been told to have cesarean surgery 2 weeks earlier. She had refused, and the theory was then, under the state's feticide law, that by refusing surgery 2 weeks earlier, she had caused the death of one of her children. She spent 105 days in jail before she pled guilty to other things in order to get out and get out of the state of Utah. Regina McKnight suffered a stillbirth. She also had a positive cocaine test. They arrested her for homicide by child abuse. I know this is not the forum I'd love, but I will come back if you invite me. Fortunately, what many people heard about what illegal drugs do has not been found supportive by the science. We ultimately know that Regina McKnight suffered a stillbirth, experienced a stillbirth, because she had an infection. It had nothing to do with her drug use, which started after she watched her mother run over by a truck. She was sentenced to 12 years in jail for homicide by child abuse. It took 8 years for us to get a court to reverse that decision. It upheld the principle, but said eventually that she had received ineffective assistance of counsel, and her trial counsel specifically had failed to call experts who would have testified about recent studies showing cocaine is no more harmful to a fetus than nicotine use, poor nutrition, lack of prenatal care, or other conditions commonly associated with the urban poor. And I just want you to know I'm quoting a unanimous South Carolina Supreme Court. It's not a New York court. I'll tell you, Jessica Clyburn was 8 months pregnant, 18 years old, history of depression, mental health questions. She feared that her boyfriend was leaving her or whatever and jumped out a window. She landed on the awning and survived, but broke her pelvis and other bones and lost the pregnancy. She was charged with homicide by child abuse. And if you're charged with homicide, you don't get out on bail. And even if you are 18, even if you have a history of mental illness, you will be locked in a county jail for years as your case works its way through the courts. I think if we'd been able to challenge it, even in South Carolina, the one state that is legally the most pro-life, that's recognized that viable fetuses are persons under the criminal law, that I think we might even have been able to challenge it there, but she could not imagine waiting a year, 2, 3 years as the case worked its way through the court system, and therefore pled guilty to manslaughter, a charge that she will always have on her record. That will always be who she is, and for every probation violation, because she was put on probation, will extend the time she may have to spend in jail. Utah last year passed a law specifically making clear that self-abortion will be punished as murder, and that is what women who can't get legal abortions do. And we have states that are actually articulating that giving birth is a crime. Pregnant women with a drug problem who give birth, there are very many bills, they've not yet passed, saying you can go to jail. So we've created this, I work in a weird world where a person who undergoes the life and health risks of pregnancy, often undergoes major surgery to bring forth life, is then arrested, and in the arrest warrant it says that her crime was giving birth to a child who was exposed to marijuana once, exposed to an illegal drug, was not properly cared for. So as we do these discussions, I think that people who are pro-lives, who fundamentally, profoundly, unquestionably value unborn life from the moment of conception, don't necessarily want legal policies that will have very broad implications for the lives of mothers, the children they will leave behind, the communities they will leave behind. And I want to talk about the strongest, most controversial perhaps ways of talking about things. I want to find one particular one. We know, if you've been participated in or watched on TV, that the signs at many anti-abortion, pro-life rallies are quite explicit. They say things like, abortion is murder. Abortion kills children. Abortion, the hidden Holocaust. There's a whole campaign that you might be aware of, the Genocide Awareness Project, in which they very vividly, with pictures, will do things like make the analogy religious choice, showing Jewish concentration camp victims, next to racial choice, showing the lynching of an African American, next to reproductive choice, showing the body parts of an aborted fetus, and making that comparison. Signs when President Obama spoke in Notre Dame said abortion is torture. And I noticed the pictures were not only of unborn children or fetuses. They were also of baby dolls, like 2- or 3-year-old baby dolls with blood on them. But the problem with this that I think pro-lives people recognize is who are we talking about? The women who have abortions are mothers. They are pregnant women. Most of them are mothers. The vast majority will become mothers. So do we, when we use this language, when we have this debate, seriously mean that a pregnant woman is no different from Hitler? That a pregnant woman is no different from the SS? That a pregnant woman in relationship to the fetus she carries is no different from a slaveholder in relationship to a slave? That a pregnant woman is no different from an executioner or a murderer? Is that really what we mean? Because that is what we're saying, ultimately. That is the only way, personally, I can understand it. I know that there are people who would like to think about it as we're just going to punish doctors, or we're just going to have a moral statement. But we know from the laws that are already being applied, and we know from the experience, the growing experience, that these ideas about women as murderers is not just staying in the context of abortion. It's being applied to Laura Pemberton. It's being applied to Sarah Burton, and other women like that. And the question again is, are we serious about how we view pregnant women? Words like genocide and Holocaust. I understand, I think to some extent, why that language makes sense. I will say I met with some folks, again, when I was out in South Dakota from the Genocide Awareness Project. This was 2006. And I said, do you discuss what's happening in Darfur, which was experiencing ethnic cleansing and genocide? And they had no idea what I was talking about, because the only genocide that was being taught was that the individual decisions that women make about their reproductive health, their moral, their religious lives, is the same as government-sponsored genocide. That the collective individual decisions our mothers make, the women we entrust to raise our children, and by the way, women today do 2/3 of the child care and 80% of the housework. So these are the people we're saying are part of a genocide. They are slaveholders. They are murderers. We entrust those women to raise and care for our children. And what I fear is that the way we frame this as pro-life, rather than really valuing unborn life, understanding what the implications are if that's translated into law so that we can also value the lives of women, means that the debate about abortion trumps everything. It means that it is worse than, I don't know if how many of you followed the billboard that was up in Soho. It was a billboard talking about, or trying to bring people to a website that, among other things, said this: there is a battle being waged in the United States that has taken more lives than any foreign war or act of terrorism. The enemy is abortion. But the people who go and have abortions are pregnant women. Most of them are mothers. And to me, what this says is that what pregnant women do in the course of their lives that murder trumps all foreign wars and all terrorism. I had a recent experience of this, and I really want to say this very carefully. I don't think any side of any debate has cornered the market on crazy, mean, nasty. It's on all sides. But I had a particular experience of it. I wrote a column responding, following the shooting of Gabrielle Giffords. Gabrielle Giffords is a second cousin of mine. I also happen to know Dr. George Tiller. I had met him many times. I had gone to his clinic. I knew him, and this will, I know, shock and potentially offend many of you, and I hope we can talk a little bit about this, but I knew him as one of the most humanitarian, kind, loving, humane people I have ever met in my life. And he was murdered, and then Gabrielle was shot, and he was shot in the face, she was shot in the face, and I ended up writing an open letter to Sarah Palin saying, this is not about blaming you, but this might be a good time to say whether you're serious about what you say, the language you use about locking and loading and putting targets on people and having events with guns in them. And one of the responses that came from that, and that's the thing I keep missing. Anyway, one of the responses to that was quite nasty. It talked about, here it is. It said, "Screw her," and I'm not implying a sexual reference. "This bitch celebrates the epitome of violence, murdering of unborn babies, yet has the unmitigated gall to prop herself up as an advocate of nonviolence." Because what I said in there is, I hope that as a true leader in America that you will speak out against violence, and that some think that the greatest leaders in this country are people who have been willing to take violence on themselves rather than commit it to others. And that when we isolate one life versus lives, does it become possible to discredit anybody who believes in nonviolence, who believes in many of the things we have shared values about, like the need for childcare, the need for health care, the fact that we're one of 2 industrialized countries that doesn't pay for any kind of paternity or maternity leave. Can we write all of that off? And as long as you support legal abortion, you have no right to speak, because you are the same as people who support genocide, murder, terrorism, and violence. I don't think that's what people really mean, but it is how it is being played out increasingly through legal mechanisms in the law and through our conversations. So I guess what I want to end by saying is that based on my experiences representing women who are personally opposed to abortion, who nevertheless have experienced the things they have, people who are spending years in jail for alleged crimes to their unborn children, that we do a disservice to all of us, to the mothers who we have, the mothers who are giving birth at this moment, and my own belief, and again this is singular versus plural, that we cannot have a true culture of life if we don't value the women who give those lives. Thank you.